I always love when I have to do sessions at conferences on topics like RIA services, which I could do and I have taught 4-day classes on. So I'm going to fit in about 40 hours of material into an hour. That always works real well. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to talk about some of the basics of RIA services that are really important to getting started, and then I'm going to skip into some of the key concepts that are really important RIA services. I'm not going to walk through step-by-step every single aspect of creating a RIA services sample. I think you've seen those demos. There's plenty of them out there. I've got some links for you as well to go through some of those. But I'm going to talk about the high points, some of the low points, where RIA services is heading. I was actually just talking with one of the head PMs, the lead PM for RIA services yesterday. A lot that they're working on right now. It's been a lot of changes. They've got some service packs and changes that are coming out as well, and some future features that are coming out. So I'll talk about that, and we'll also talk about some tips that we've learned along the way with using RIA services. So we've got a big long title. I like our long titles at Microsoft. Tips and tricks for building effective, rich internet applications. And I am John Papa, work at Microsoft. I'm the Silverlight evangelist up there, and if you like to tweet, you can tweet me at John Papa with an underscore. So what are we going to talk about today? As I mentioned, we're going to talk about at a glance. First of all, why would you want to use RIA services? What does it do for you? What problem is it solving? And that's what I try to do a lot when I'm getting into new technology. I love new technology, so I always jump head first in, I look at it. Then I always try to come back a little. I've actually got a sticker up my board. It's always there. It says, what problem is it solving? So before you jump into RIA services, it's important to understand why you're jumping in. Is it going to help you in your situation, or is it just something new and cool that you're going to look at? So we'll look at kind of what this is, how it works, and I'll talk a little bit about where it came from, give you an idea of some of its evolution. There's a lot of key concepts in RIA services. I'll look at them, and I'm kind of split them up between server side and client side, because it does affect both the server side and the client side aspects when you're dealing with RIA services. And then I'll do a little bit of a walkthrough through an application that we have that uses RIA services and throw some tips in there as well. So with that said, why don't we get started here? Cool. So at a glance, why would you want to use it? Well, most applications, you're going to have some kind of a business model. On the server, you're going to deal with entities, either classes that you've created on your own in your applications, or you're reading a database into something like Link to SQL and Hibernate, Entity Framework, or your own custom creation. You've got something on the back end which stores your data. You get something you're manipulating that models your business. You also have a concept for a screen. Your users know what they want to do, or they have an idea of what they want to do, and they try to get it to you. So you want to figure out how to get that data and that business model and all your rules up to a screen concept that you got working through, maybe with your designers, to figure out how you tie it all together. So you got the bottom layer. Usually your business has a pretty good idea what data they want to track. And then you've got the top layer. They have an idea of how the process and workflows are going to work through. There's a lot of muck that goes in between, plumbing, as we call it, that helps you get from point A to point B. So what are those common tasks we always do? Some of those are exposing our data. How do you expose your data up to the client? I'll bet you if we ask 10 people in this room, we probably have at least 7 different ways that people expose their data to the client. And there's a lot of things you can do differently. Do you expose your database directly to a web service and have that web service exposed to the client? If we're assuming we're just talking Silverlight at first, we'll just start there. So do you expose your client, your data to your client through a web service directly? Or do you have some kind of indirection in there as well, like a Link to SQL and Hibernate or Entity Framework? Do you put some kind of business layer in there? Do you then use that web service and use it with WCF to do SOAP? Do you do .NET to .NET binary protocol? Do you do OData? Are you using JSON? Using XML? What are you using to transport this? There's a lot of things that go in between these layers, and they get very repetitive after a while. Once you expose one business object up through a service, I'll even give you 2. Maybe expose 2 of them. You kind of get a pattern going. You expose the first one. Maybe it's got some children entities. You expose it up through a web service. Maybe you choose .NET to .NET protocol. And then you consume it on the client. You're exposing a get my object, get a list of my objects, update, insert, and delete maybe. 5 methods. You start repeating this through all your entities. It's a pretty easy pattern, pretty easy to put together. Once you get going with it, you can develop it and run away. But it's very monotonous. Be nice if there's a way to do this pretty automatically instead of writing a lot of code for it. Another thing that you do a lot of is enforcing security. Your business model has to enforce that security. So you've got to create some kind of authentication and authorization tools, or at least the authentication side. You want to know who the person is, and then you got to decide, okay, now I'm using auth. Am I using WinAuth? Am I using ASP.NET Auth? Is it a custom authentication? Windows Live? What am I doing? And then for authorization, what are you using to do the authorization piece as well? Role-based security. You've got administrators, managers, guests, read-only users. What kind of users do you have? This list here is on and on and on. These are the plumbing pieces, the muck that goes between your data and your screens. It's your architecture. So how do you fill the blanks in with your architecture? A lot of the stuff is very repetitive. Once you enforce rules on one object, it's pretty easy to replicate that pattern to somebody else. Generally what happens in an architecture is once you figure out how you want that security to work, you write it, maybe once or twice, then you document it and let your whole team know, have some kind of a code review, and they kind of move forward with it. Business rules, same subject. You want to create business rules, you go through the same process. Change tracking, now we're moving back to the client. You're on the client, how do you know, how does the screen know when the save button should be enabled or cancel enabled? How do you know what data to send back? You're going to create some kind of a pattern to deal with that. You're going to deal with paging and filtering and sorting on the client? Yeah, your users are going to expect at least some level of detail to do that. And again, it's a very repetitive process. Marshalling updates back to the server. With Silverlight, you got to deal with asynchronous calls. You may want to deal with different endpoints as well. So there's a lot of different things you have to deal with in your architecture. So why would you want to use RIA services? RIA services can help do all of this for you. It can help put a layer on top of your data to expose your existing business objects. So you might already have business objects. Maybe you've got NHibernate, or you've got Entity Framework, and you want to expose those to the client. You can put RIA services in your application on the web server, have it talk to that business model, and it sees your objects, and then it can expose them for you. It'll give you a wizard the first time you run it to see which objects you want to expose. So if you have 100 objects, you just go through the wizard real quick. It'll expose them automatically. It writes the code for you. And then after you do it the first time, you can modify and tinker with the code yourself. It's not magic code where you're not supposed to ever touch it. It creates it once for you, gets you started like a template, and then you run. If you're using things like Entity Framework, it's more closely tied to the Entity Framework because that's a Microsoft product. So RIA services works really well with that. NHibernate or your own custom objects, very easy to do still. A little more coding you have to write. In fact, I do a weekly show on Channel 9 at Microsoft called Silverlight TV. You can go there at silverlight.tv is the web address. And on there, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we did a whole show with a lead PM of RIA services. And he walked through examples using link to SQL, custom entities, and NHibernate, and how you can hook into those objects to RIA services. So we tend a lot in demos to use Entity Framework because that's our product, but you can show how you can do those other ones well. So once RIA services exposes all that, it has a security model. It automatically hooks into ASP.NET Auth, so you can use that, or you can put some other authentication in. It performs business rules that you can do. You've even got field level validation, object level validation, or custom business rules. It does all sorts of change tracking and paging and filtering for you on the client as well. So why would you want to use this? Because a lot of the stuff you could write on your own. It's not hard. It's just a lot of plumbing. A lot of stuff you write on your own, and probably from project to project you tinker with a little bit as you move forward. RIA services does for you and gives you a consistent pattern that's recognizable and it works very well. So it gives you a way to kind of jumpstart your project and get moving pretty quickly. One thing that applies specifically to Silverlight that's nice is in RIA services you get this domain data source control, or the DDS. The domain data source control in Silverlight automatically builds in your loading of the data, all of your rejection of changes, saving of changes. It does change tracking with the domain context in the client for you, and it figures out how to do paging, filtering, and sorting. So there's a control in Silverlight that does a lot of this for you that's built in. You don't have to use that control. In fact, I've written probably, 20 applications in RIA services that are more than demos, and of those 20, I'd say half of them I used that control, and then half of them the client didn't want it, so we wrote our own code. But it's a nice way to jumpstart you. Another nice thing about Silverlight with RIA services is it handles asynchronous calls for you. That is a big leap sometimes for people moving from Windows Forms or ASP.NET, is how do they deal with those callback functions. RIA services will help you. When you say, go get my employees, it'll handle the callback for you, so it makes it seem like it's synchronous, so it's easier to pick up on. Okay, so that's the big picture view. Why do you want to use it? In short, because it makes your life a little simpler. When wouldn't you want to use RIA services? I get asked this a lot, and not just for RIA services, but for anything. I've got an existing application, and right there off the bat, I'm like, okay, then why do you want to change something? Is it in production? Is it running? Is there a problem? It's in production, yep. It's running, yep. And there's no problem. No. There's a new technology out called RIA services. I want to jump on it. If you want to, go ahead, go for it. But if there's not a reason, a business value for doing it, you're going to have a hard time getting it past your manager generally. So should you just jump to RIA services because I say so? No. You should jump to it if there's a reason or a need that you see. So here's a picture out of one of our documentation. It talks about the solution that you have. On your server, you'll generally have some kind of entities and some data access layer. Let's say you don't use any other tools. You're just creating your own. Your data access layer might just be some class you wrote in ADO.NET, talk to a database. And your entities might just be simply employee or customer. In your domain service, this is where RIA services can come in. You create a domain service object. It inherits from a special class, and it points to your entities. So then it starts mapping these services to your entities so it can expose those objects. And it generates WCF services and endpoints for your client, your Silverlight client, so it can talk to those. Now, it also copies those entities up to the client. So it does code generation from the server up to the client and puts them in your service references folder. So you then have the entities, the same exact entities on server and client. Because one of the problems you get into when you start dealing with distributed systems, if you expose through a WCF service a list of entities to a client, it's going to automatically generate these proxy classes for you on the client. Some people don't like that and they like to create their own version on the client. Then you have to do mapping between the entities, which is a little messy. RIA services generates basically a mapped class for you in the client, so you don't have to worry about that. So whatever you pass from the server, you're getting up to the client, no problems. RIA services also gives you this domain context in the client, which handles your loading, your link queries. So you can write link queries on the client of the server to go get your data. And it also handles your change tracking. Okay, so we talked about a lot of this at a glance, and we'll get into some demos here too. We've got, I think, 3 demos to show you. First key concept on the client side, we'll work our way down, is connectivity web services. You're in Silverlight, you want to connect to web services, you're using RIA service, it automatically hooks it up. You don't have to go to add service reference. That's key right off the bat. You don't have to generate these service references. Anytime you change something in the domain service in the server and you build, it's going to regenerate your web service for you. It's completely behind the scenes, good to go. We'll talk about change tracking and how that works in the domain context. We'll talk about that domain data service control. Sorry, it's a domain data source control. There's a typo by me. It's a domain data source control. Validation techniques in RIA services that works on the client for you. And link query access, because that's key. I mean, it's really, really cool that on a client, you can write a link query to some data that you may not have. And it's telling RIA services through WCF to go down, get that data, filter it, run the query, and pull back up what you just needed. So I can say, go get me all the clients with the last name beginning with P. On the client, using a link query, it'll go tell RIA services to go get that data and filter it out in the server and bring up just that subset. So change tracking. The key to change tracking on the client is a class called the domain context. This is my favorite of all the classes in RIA services. Of all the architectures I've ever written, the one that has always given me the most headaches is change tracking. Domain context deals with getting data and saving data, handling what's changed, and sending it up and down the chain for you from the client. Why is change tracking a problem sometimes? Because when you write an architecture, let's say you've got some kind of an object on the client, like an employee. You need to know when those fields have changed. So one way to do that is to create like a mirror object, like a delta object for employee, and then you can compare the 2 fields when they change. Maybe put some events in there when the keyboards change or the objects change, or use some data binding features to know when the values change on each property. Or you could have one object, employee, that's got like a current value and original value. It gets pretty easy with one object. And that's what demos are, right? Yeah, you get into, okay, real world. I've got an application that's got 15 objects, all hierarchical, some big object graph. Now you've got to write change tracking so your entire object tree gets walked up and down the chain. A lot more complicated to do. You can do it. Done it. I hate it. Made me go bald real quick. So one of my favorite features in RIA services is the domain context. It handles change tracking for you. You're all done. It's great. It's the one feature from datasets. How many people here use datasets still? I still do. Like, come on, don't be shy. You know you do. So datasets are still out there. One of the best features of datasets was change tracking. It was built into the object. In RIA services, it's all built for you, which is nice, without all that extra metadata. So it handles that state for you. The domain data source control, I spelled it right here, is a control that you get in Silverlight on the client, which does a lot of things for you. So let's say you get your data through the domain context. You say, Mr. Domain Context, go get me a list of customers. It's going to call WCF through RIA services, bring it back up. And then once you get that, you can filter. You can create filters through XAML or through the properties, because it's all integrated into the designer, and then filter out those customers by name or country. You can also deal with the binding automatically. So you can use standard data binding for the object right to your controls on the screen. It does sorting for you as well. If you got filtering, you got to have sorting. And it also handles paging. It's very simple. One of the examples I'm going to show you, I think it brings back about 40 records that I've selected through a link query that I've already cut down by category. And then once those 40 records are back, I can sort them, I can page them, and I can filter them. Without writing any code, it's all using this control. So it doesn't just do that, though. It also helps you submit changes, reject changes, handles loading your data. You can also defer loading. So let's say you want to go get a parent object, like an order, and then later go get the details for the order. You can do that as well through the domain context and DDS. And one of the newer features, and this was out, I think, in May, middle of May, we released a new version of the Visual Studio Designer tools for Visual Studio 2010, codename was Cider. And with those tools, you can now use all the design support. So you can drag and drop onto the designer. You can bind with the DDS. You can automatically hook up the reject changes, submit changes events, and wire into those if you like to, all through the properties window in the designer. And I'll show you where some of that works. It's pretty cool. So let's look at a little more client-side stuff, and we'll jump into the client-side demo. Validation is actually, I'm oversimplifying it with this slide. I kind of like my small slides. Validation, there's two things you got to be aware of. Validate property and validation errors. Validate property is a method that you run. Always screws me up because it's got the word property in it. It's actually a verb, validate the property. So you're going to validate this property that you pass in. So your business object, you can call this method in your setter, and you can say, all right, I want you to validate this now. It's going to run against any business rules that you've created against it for that object. So that's what tells it, okay, in the setter, someone's changing it, make sure it's a valid property. Validation errors is an optional collection you can deal with. Let's say you find a validation error, and it's not some standard validation error that comes out of the box. Like, we all get the things like, this is a required field, the string length has to be at least 10 characters, things like that. All that comes out of the box as RIA services. It's really nice. Validation errors is for your own custom errors. So you might have some database-generated stored messages that you need to serve up. You know, credit limit has been exceeded by customer. You must be a blind man with one leg and 4 eyes to buy this product, some kind of crazy rule. So you can use that kind of stuff to fill in the validation errors collection. And once you do that, you can bind that to a validation summary control. Validation summary control with RIA services. You put that on the screen, and it'll show you a list of all the validation errors in the collection. So I mentioned some things come out of the box, RIA services. And what comes out of the box, you get required fields. You simply put an attribute on your objects, tell them which ones are required. What's the range value? So you can say the age has to be between 0 and 100. You can use it for decimals as well. Regular expressions, great for emails or phone numbers, things like that. I hate writing regular expressions. I always go to a website, have it figured out for me. Highly recommend that. Display names, what do you want to display? By default, if you use the binding, you can use the captions from the name of the field in the database or the object. RIA services will display it. I've worked on systems like some of the accounting systems, and the names of the fields in the table, sometimes they're like A, B, X, Y, Z. I mean, literally, it's obfuscation. So you want to change the display names, you can simply do that through an attribute. String length, as I mentioned earlier, or you can just blow it out of the water and say, there's a custom validation, I want you to run my own validation. You can create your own class. You can also validate at class level. So you don't just want to say, I want to check to see if the age is between this range and that range. I also want to check to see if that age is between this range and that range, and they are making over $50,000 a year, and some other rule. So you can combine different rules together with custom validation. Okay. So let's flip over to a quick demo. Find the correct one. All right. So here we've got a validation example. I've got a employee object, and in this case, what I'm going to show you are these data annotations. So the data annotations are in the brackets. Here we've got display, we've got key, we've got editable, some other ones that are out there. So what do I want to do here? I'm going to say, all right, I've got this employee ID field. I don't want that showing up on the screen as employee ID, like if I bind it to a grid or some kind of a list. I want it to say ID, and the description is going to be employee ID. So that's the name of the field I'm mapping with, and that's the name that's going to show up on the screen. So you can use a display name. Key identifies it as the key for the particular field. You don't have to worry about that. RIA Services will throw that in there for you. It figures out when it generates from the database for your model. Is it editable? In this case, I want it editable false. The default is true, so you only have to put this in there if it's something you don't want to be edited. Required field. Optionally, you can put a message there. That's kind of a dumb message. If I was going to put the message on, I would leave it out altogether. The default message is you've got to put a required field in. So you can say required field, and here you can type in some kind of a message saying, yeah, dummy, required field. Your string length. How long is it? Cannot exceed 40. Again, display names. Let's see if we can find a different one down there. Yep, there's a range that we have. Somebody can make a lot of money. What's that, $1 million? Yep. Somebody here making $1 million a year? Put my hand down. Nope. Good. All right. So next one here, we've got custom validation. This one's kind of cool. I like this because now notice you can combine different validation techniques. First, it's going to check the required field, but it's also going to do this custom validation. So I put in the type of class here. This is my own class, and what I'm doing is going to that class, which is static, and it's got a method for validate employee and validate age. Now I've got two different methods here. If I go back for a minute, you'll see I'm calling the method validate age. It's using some reflection here based upon the name. I'm going to call employee validator dot validate age. So here's my validate age method. I'm passing in the age, and I'm checking to see, and these are just some bogus rules I wrote. If the age is over 150, return this one here, you've got to be less than that. If the age is under 0, you've got to be greater than it. And I'm returning back success if it's good. If not, I'm returning back a validation result. These aren't exceptions. These are validation results. And as validation results come back, they can get stored in that errors validation collection, and you can bind them to the validation summary. You can also hit databases if you had to do this here, or call a WCS service, talk to other objects. You can do all sorts of stuff, anything you want in this type of class. So you notice here, I'm not just checking the age. I'm passing in the entire employee. I'm checking the employee's age and salary. So that's how you use a custom validation. Now to use these attributes, there's two ways you can do it. By default, if you use RIA Services, it's going to allow you to use these out of the box. I'm going to reference them. If you don't do that, you have to reference the component model data annotations. There's a namespace for data annotations here. If you go see it in the object browser. Come on, baby. Go. Maybe because I'm in full screen. Let's go back. There we go. So here under data annotations, we've got a whole series of attributes. You can check to see what you've got. Some of these are more for default behaviors. So if you have relationships and you use RIA services and things like that, you get association attributes, concurrency for database checks. You've got the range one we mentioned, regular expression. I don't think I showed an example of that, but it's pretty simple to use. Required, string length, And we've got the validation attribute as well for the custom validators. So the validation is pretty straightforward. Now if we run an example for this, let's see if this is the example. Nope, that's not it. Let me crank it open. If you run the example of this, you'll see what happens when RIA services notice there's validation. It sees those data annotation markers on the properties, and it picks those up, and it says, all right, so certain properties here are being bound to the screen. If the data annotations are in place, I know that I had to do some kind of validation. So it's going to automatically hook in a few things for us. So let's run the application. Now this is going to be running a fictitious bookstore that I put together. And this bookstore is going to hit a database which is using the Entity Framework. And the RIA services is exposing those objects. And we're going to load up our bookshelf. I'll go to full screen mode. So a couple of things happen here, and I'll go through all this in a moment, but notice first I'm looking at a series of books. Let's say I try to log in. RIA services out of the box gives you authentication, so I didn't write any of this. It's very nice. You can customize this form. It generates it for you. But if you don't like the way it looks, you can change it. It's picking up on the theme. I'm using the Cosmopolitan theme that comes with Silverlight 4 with a theme pack. So out of the box, if I like that theme, it automatically picks up on the theme. And let's see what happens. I click Register Now. You notice a couple things are happening. One, I've got username is bold. It means it's a required field. There's some rule on this. So required fields become bold for you. So here I could type in Big Doggy. And it's all good. Friendly names there. Email address. Let's say I type in dog. Oh, I've got a problem. It turns red. I must have broken a rule. If I click over that, it says invalid email. Emails must use the format of user@company.com. So I could say dog@doggy.com. And then we're good. If I put my cursor over the little eyes over here, you'll notice this is where descriptors get picked up. Earlier I talked about the description field in the display. This is where the descriptors get picked up, and the messages that you customize for those attributes get placed inside of here. So if you put a description in, it'll pick it up with these descriptors, and then the user can look at them to see what do I have to do. Okay, so let's go back to the login page, and we'll kick out of there for a minute. So we can see the validation works pretty well, and then the other thing we're noticing here is we've got 3 sets of data on the screen that are using binding. I need 3 calls to the database. In my Silverlight client, let's walk through that architecture again. Silverlight client says, I got a client, I'm using the DDS control. Notice I've got sorting right here. I've got paging down here, so I can flip between page 1 and page 2. And I've got filtering. When I click on General, it's automatically going to invoke the query client side to go tell it, hey, I don't just want to get the books that are in business, I want the ones that are general category or technology. So I'm hitting the database 3 times. Go get me a list of books, go get me a list of categories, and get me the book of the day out of the book of the day table. Now for the sorting, we can see here I can sort it by author, which is hard to see since we don't always show the author's name, or I can sort by title. Now you can see that there. And I can say, hey, is there anything that's got Silverlight in the title? How shocking. This is a book by John Papa. So here's this really cool book that you can get, and it's listed up there. And anything I type in, they'll sort by. I'm also filtering it. So if I get rid of that word as well, come back down, you'll see everything else happens, and it unapplies the filter. The DDS, when I do the filter in that box, is not hitting the database again. It's filtering the results on the screen automatically. So it's not hitting a database call there. But when I do when I select the book category, it is binding and getting the data that I need, calling a load query from the RIA service. Okay, I think I'm in zoom level. Let me zoom out. Now you can see the whole page. A little smaller, but you can see the whole thing. So if we go back to business, I think, one of them has a couple pages. Technology, there we go. We go over to the last page. You can see we've got 3 pages of data, and we can flip through them pretty easily. All the data is local. We're only showing 10 at a time. You can change this through the DDS control. So let's take a look at how that control works. If I can find my stop button, that would be really cool. All right, so our web page, as soon as the cursor comes back, a couple things get generated for us in the client. So on the client, you're going to see a couple folders like models. These are the models that get generated for us from RIA services for the user. We're also going to see views. So it's creating these views here. It's got an about page, a home page. It's got an error window by default. So these are nice. So let's say you standard architecture, you can put together like a login screen, an error page, something like that. These are automatically built in. You can change the way these looks. They're already wired into certain error conditions, and you can use the designer here to deal with them. If we look at that login page, here's the login form. Out of the box, again, it's going to pick up on the theme. I can zoom in on this a little bit once my cursor comes back to life. It's so fast. I love my laptop. Okay, so let's zoom in a little. So you can see here's our login page. We've got our required fields. We've got everything all set up. So if we look at the code, you'll see down here that we've got everything using binding. There's no let's load this field and pull data out of there. It's all using data binding, just like we want to deal with XAML. Okay, so let's go look at our view that's actually showing the page. And for this one, we're going to look at main page XAML. And let's get rid of the XAML for a minute. So there's our design page. And you can see by default, we're just getting this main book club theme that's going on. And then for the views, we're going to have an edit book window. We've got a home and an edit book form. Home is the main page that shows all of our data that we were looking at earlier. So now over here, if I click on book categories and I go to properties, what you're actually seeing is a list box. And that list box is an item source. So over in the designer, again, this is all integrated. We could click on the button and it pulls up what's the source. On the top says element name category domain data source. When I created the data source, the RIA services, it created a domain data source for me, that DDS control, and I was able to drag it. It's this yellow guy right here, over from my data sources window, which usually takes a couple seconds to update, and then dragged it onto my list box. When I dragged that, and here we've got a book of the day or category, I just dragged the, I think that's the categories, over to the category page. So I could drag the book and drop it onto here. It's already bound, so I don't want to do that again. And it would rebind that. So when I drag this DDS over onto the page, a couple things happen. It creates a DDS control in the XAML. It names it. It links it and binds it as the data source for the binding data source for the control, like a list box by default that you're using. And let's say you didn't want a list box. You come down here. We got a data grid or details, just like Windows Forms it does. Let's say I wanted something different. Details is great for like editing, data grid for listing. In Silverlight, I like to use a list box a lot. So instead of doing data grid, I'm going to choose customize. And now this is a list of data. I can come down and say, all right, I want to also throw in list box as an option. And I want to set that as the default. So when I hit OK, now you'll notice slightly up here, there's a different icon. And if I drag that onto the page, I'm going to get the books listed in a list box instead. And it creates an item template for you. So all that's set up by default. Let's go back to our page here. Again, looking at the categories and properties, we can scroll through here and we can see the item template, which we can click on, and it shows you there's different item templates all through the designer that you can play with. In the item source, if we go back to that, we're on the domain item source. We're looking at the data method. You can also use converters if you need to. If I click on this list, these are my books. The item source should be changed to a different DDS. So I just drag them onto each list. It generates a list box for me and does the binding. Very, very simple. Okay, let's hide this guy for a minute, because I thought I hit him. So one of the newer features that came out in RIA services, I think it was middle of the summer, is now when you have a DDS, it shows you this little yellow guy in the bottom left-hand corner. And the reason it does that is so you can visually see, yes, you're using data source controls, and here's the three you're using. Book, book of the day, and category. So you can actually access the properties of each of these. So let's look at the category. We selected him. We go over to the properties. Now this is the properties of that data source control. Here we've got a domain context set up. The domain context is called bookshelf web. There we go. Set up the default data context, bookshelf web services.book club context. That's all good to go. If we go over to the XAML, you can see the domain data source control listed in there. It's set to automatically load. What that means is by default it's going to load the data as soon as you open the page. But if you don't want it to until after something happens, you set that to false, and you can just call an a method to make it happen. We're using design time data. Then we call this event here loaded data when the data's been loaded. We have it a name. This is the query it's going to call. This query here is the name of the query that got generated on our domain service. And then you can see data context binding. And that's all there is to a data source control. And it's automatically got all of our filtering and paging and everything that we need to do. So let's say we want to do a little bit more, because we always want to do more. So demos are great, but what happens when you want to change the default behavior? So here we've got a domain data source control on the client. In this guy, we want to change the way sorting works. So what I do is I create a sort descriptor. In my XAML, I've done this here. I'm saying for that sort descriptor, when somebody is looking at books and they choose to sort, I want it to sort using binding. Choose the selected item for the name CBO sort. There's a combo box on my screen called CBO sort. It's got author or title. So I can sort by author name or title. So I'm saying sort by the property in the selected item's content based upon if it's author or title. Pretty simple. Filter descriptors. Here I'm putting two conditions onto it. Then filter out the list of books where it's equal to the category that's been bound to the category list box. So it automatically binds over to the selected item of the category list box, finds the category ID, and binds itself. Also, look for a contains operator on the selected item in the book. So here we're saying go to that little text box I typed into. Whatever I typed in, we're going to do a contains on it. So that's why when I typed Silverlight, it found any book with the title Silverlight somewhere in the title. And again, I'm using as much binding as possible. I don't hard code anything I don't have to. So let's say you don't like XAML. What? You don't like XAML? So what you can do is you can flip over to the properties. Try to open that up. All right, so let's look at the filter descriptors. I've selected my book of the day, my book domain data source. Filter descriptors are over here in the properties window. I click on the three little pimples button, and here I can choose a filter descriptor. And you can see here, it's a category ID. It's using is equal to, and here's a whole bunch of other lists of filters I can use. This is the cool part, because if you're in XAML, yeah, you've got IntelliSense, but what if you forget the names of these things, or the name of the property even? This is nice because you can just go in there and you can type in what you want, select it, and it creates that XAML for you. So when I did this actual demo, when I created it, it took me about 25 minutes end to end, mostly because I was making sure what I was getting into. And I also, I'd say maybe 10 minutes of the time was making sure I had the right filter descriptors and sorting. It would have taken a lot longer if I had had to type that all XAML by hand, because I'm not that good at that. So if I want to add another filter descriptor, I just click Add, and it'll generate the XAML for that filter descriptor, and I can add a different filter in there. Sorting works the same way. So I go down to Sort Descriptors, and you'll see here my sort descriptor, ascending order, and what am I sorting by? The property path in this case is another binding operation to the combo box, the selected item, whether it's author or title. I can also set up grouping. I didn't do this in this example, but I could go and create grouping for that particular list as well if I want to do grouping options. So it's pretty cool. I mean, out of the box you get a lot, and you don't have to write a lot of code, and it puts all that client-side muck in there for you. Now, when I call the submit button, let's go look at the submit button. Did I wire up the submit button? Boy, that would be funny. Looks like I didn't wire it up. Okay, let's look at the loaded button. So when things get loaded for the book, you'll notice all I'm doing is after the data's been loaded, I'm just checking to see. This is the callback method. Once the data's been loaded, I'm checking to see if any errors occurred. It automatically calls this for me. I don't have to go do some kind of asynchronous call and then do a completed handler. It's going to make the call for me. All I have to do is handle what's going to happen when it's done loading the data. That's why you'll see three pretty synonymous, and I would probably just take this code out and call the same method to display an error message if data came back improperly. This is all the code in that home page. So there's the loaded methods for little error handling. When I click the edit button, you're going to edit the book. And let's see what else we got here. And that's it. Oh, I changed the title. There's a lot of code there. So when I run this, let me show you what happens when I change data. Oh, awesome. What did I break? Oh, yeah. Gotta love Control-Z. I added that click handler. Now let's try running it. I do that a lot. I'll add an event handler. I delete the handler, forget to delete it out of the XAML. So here's my application. Yes, disable that toolbar. In my application, notice I can't edit anything. There's an edit button, but it's not clickable. I have to log in with my authentication. Luckily, I've already registered. Please, everybody turn their heads. Do not look at my password. And once I log in, my edit button is available, and it says, Welcome, John Papa. It's using authentication on the server. When I click Edit, you'll see I get that window here for my editing. This is what I did is I dragged a DDS out of the toolbox. I dragged it onto my screen using the Details option. So instead of generating a list box or data grid, it generated details. And then I've got my validation automatically implemented where I need it. And I can change this and say, wow, you know, this is a fantastic book. It's a fantastic book. There you go. And it changes the data automatically here, and when I submit it, it's going to call the DDS submit button, submit changes method, automatically down to the server. So I don't want to leave out the server. There's quite a bit on that side that we have to talk about. We looked at all the stuff the client does for you. Server side, you got some really cool stuff. Exposes all your objects for you through domain service. The domain service class, really, really simple. I'll show you an example of that. In addition to what you get out of the box with RIA Services, which does a .NET to .NET binary protocol by default, so you can talk to Silverlight, you can also expose your RIA Services very simply using OData or JSON or SOAP. All you have to do is download the RIA Services toolkit. There's a toolkit. It's a 1 meg download. If you use the web platform installer, it'll automatically pick it up for you and download it, install it. That toolkit allows you to expose OData and JSON and SOAP, so your RIA services can be consumed by any client you want, like Windows Phone. And it implements security for you on the server side. So the domain service is really key. You've got a wizard that you use to create it, and all it does is it creates a class that inherits from the domain service class. It marks that class as being enabling client access, which basically allows the client to see it. And then it implements methods, iQueryable methods, for all your objects you expose. They're iQueryable. It doesn't return the actual object. It returns an iQueryable, so Link can actually call it from the client. And in our case, we're using a link to entities domain service, so it can actually talk to entity framework. When you add in a domain service class, the wizard's larger than this, but basically you just name the service, you choose enabling client access, and then you can also check expose an OData endpoint if you've downloaded that toolkit. And all that does is adds a couple extra lines to your web config so you can actually expose it through OData. So your transmission options. By default, you get binary .NET to .NET transmission out of the box. You've got SOAP, you've got OData, and you've got JSON. Oops, went a little too far. Those require the RIA Services toolkit. Pretty simple to do, and all you have to do to call the OData and JSON is when you call the SVC, you can call it directly through a URL. Call the name of your service and do /OData or /JSON, and then it'll return back the data in that format. So to set up your endpoints, if you want to do that and expose your data differently through different web services, again, you don't have to change anything with your code. It's just a web config setting. You have to install the kit through WebPI. Again, it's 1 meg, real quick. You reference the OData DLL, for example, if that's what you want to expose. You change your config settings. Really easy to do. One option right now is, and this will happen in the future, but right now there is no update or link query access using OData, though. So you can use it for pure pulling the data. I have an entire episode on this topic on Silverlight TV that I'll refer you guys to. If you go back to silverlight.tv, I did a half-hour show with the PM who wrote this code. His name is Dipesh Manani. Excellent demonstration put together, and shows you how to pull different endpoints together. He even uses Excel as a client to show that any client can do it. And all you have to do is basically set the query attribute on your method that gets generated in the domain service. And what it puts in your config file are these three sections: an OData, SOAP, and JSON. So it just puts those sections in your config file inside the domain services node, and then those endpoints are available, so you can go to your service.svc/OData or JSON. To access them, you just call the name of your web project, .svc/OData, or with SOAP, you just say .svc, or JSON, you stick on JSON. Very simple. So authentication. Security always comes down to these two guys, authentication and authorization. When you create your domain service, you're going to want to deal with authentication, make sure you know who the user is. So you set this attribute called requires authentication if you want to use it. And I'll show you where that comes. It uses ASP.NET Auth out of the box. Right on your domain service class, and here's a class that gets generated by RIA services. We're creating a book club service. It's inheriting from the link to entities domain service, because I'm using Entity Framework. And it's of type book club entities, which is the name of my entity model. I'm enabling client access because I want this to have an endpoint that clients can see, and I'm requiring authentication, which means if I leave this attribute on there and I don't authenticate, it's going to raise an exception if somebody tries to access one of the methods. Authorization. Once you've got authentication in place, you can use authorization to allow people to do something or not do something based upon roles. So it uses the identity of the person, the principal, and you can use the requires role attribute and stick that on your method to require what kind of a role you have to use. And these don't have to be the built-in roles. You can create your own roles structure, use your own auth database. So requires role, here we're saying you have to be an admin to delete a book. If I try to call this method, I'm not an admin, I'm not in that role, it will raise an exception. Okay, so let's go back and look at this code. In our domain service, I'll click out a full screen. The domain service itself is pretty simple to look at. This guy here got generated when I ran the wizard quickly, and it wrote this line of code and this line of code for me. I put this requires authentication in there and commented it out. If I uncomment this and run the application, it's going to generate an error automatically. And the reason it does that is because as soon as I load the application, remember my domain data source controls on the client, how all had auto load equals true? So as soon as it loads, it's going to try to hit the services. And when it tries to do that, I have not yet logged in, so therefore it's going to raise an exception. So what I could have done is I could have said you have to log in before you can use anything, but I would have set auto load to false on all those queries, so nothing got hit first. And then I could do authentication. And by default, it tells you in the to-do what you can set up here. It creates this get books for you. I added in the order by. It created this entire method other than what I just highlighted there. For insert book, it handles the code for you to make sure that it attaches the book entity that comes back and calls whatever underlying data access layer that you're using. Update book, same thing. And delete book, notice I've got requires role. In this case, you can't delete unless you're an admin. I can also write more complex queries, not that this is too complex. But notice for book of the day, I've got a little extra thing in here called an include. In this case, I'm saying don't just get the book of the day class, which has just got a book ID in it and a day. I don't know what the book ID means. I need the information about that book. So what I need to do is say include the book class too. So it's going to get a hierarchical object graph. It's going to return the book of the day and its child is book. So in this case, I'm only getting the one for the current day, and I'm getting one. So if there's more than one book of the day, I'm only getting the first one. But this include method is really important. I see a lot of people where they'll go off and they'll write their methods, and they'll use several includes, and they'll bring back like 15 objects every time someone calls one of them. That can get real big real quick. This gets to one of my tips. You don't want to bring back more data than you need. You can always go get extra data if you have to. So, other thoughts. which gets us to send required data only. Don't go get all the customers with all of their orders, every order detail, every product, and every order history, all in one shot. Worked on applications that can be millions of records. The client will be sitting for a long time waiting for that asynchronous method to come back, probably with timeout. So you want to bring back data that you want. And you can use tools like Fiddler. If anybody here hasn't used Fiddler, I highly recommend it. It's a free tool. Just search for Fiddler, Bing it, you'll find it. Very easy. It's a network sniffing tool. You can watch what your queries are getting, watch the calls, and watch what comes back from RIA services. Use includes where needed. Sometimes you're going to need to get certain subsets of data or object graphs. If you use the include on the server side, that means anytime it's asking for that parent object, it's going to get back the child too. Choose your endpoints. Don't write two web service classes, just one for JSON, one for OData, and another one for RIA services to do the client-to-client. Write one domain service and expose the endpoints through the config file the way I was talking about. It only takes a couple minutes. And then every method in your domain service class is exposed through whatever endpoints you expose. A lot better than writing multiple classes. And using custom validation rules is really cool. There's a couple of techniques. You can actually hit database files or use XML-based validation as well. It's a little more than we've got time for today, but it's something you can do with that custom validation rule